My name is John Viehe. Welcome to Chautauqua People. My guest today is Bill Clinger. Bill Clinger is a third-generation Chautauquan, a native of Warren, Pennsylvania. After graduation from Johns Hopkins, he served in the United States Navy as a naval intelligence officer, returned to Pennsylvania and worked for the New Process Company, going to law school in his early 30s, graduating from law school at the University of Virginia. He then returned to Warren and served in a general practice law firm, and he was a member of the Pennsylvania Constitutional Convention, entered politics, and was elected to the United States House of Representatives from a Northwest Pennsylvania district numbered 23. Now, he stayed 9 terms in the House of Representatives and rose through the committee structure on the Republican side, becoming chairman of a committee there. I wonder if you could tell us about what the committee was and what you did on that.
It's a committee on oversight and reform and oversight, basically. In other words, any issue that was required reform of the government structure came to our committee, and basically we conducted oversight over the entire government, really.
Right.
Because that was our primary function was the oversight function, which is a very important function.
Very important function. How long were you the chairman?
I was chairman for 2 years. My last 2 years in Congress, I was a ranking member for 6 years before that. So I was on the committee for my entire congressional career.
So you really had some depth then of the knowledge of the issues from that
pretty much
length of service. So what were the major accomplishments on that committee during your watch?
Well, I think the main thing that I'm really proudest of in my career in Congress was the reform of the way government buys everything, from paper clips to F-16s to desks and whatever the government buys. The reason we needed to do this was because over the years, the sort of incrustation of rules and regulations that made buying things or offering to sell things to the government so difficult that fewer and fewer businesses were willing to even put in a bid, were willing even to compete to get the work, because the harassment that they had to go through to get the contract was not worth it. And the result of that was, of course, if you had fewer people bidding on F-16s, the price was going to go up. There was not as much competition, the price would go up. So we were increasingly spending more and more and getting less and less for our money. And so the objective of the committee at that point was to get rid of the incrustation of unnecessary regulations and hoops that you got to jump through to get a government contract, make it more like a private business, the way they would go about contracting, and that's what we ended up doing. Right.
And what was the name of that final law?
Sort of it was called the Clinger-Cohen Act. Actually,
great name.
It was in alphabetical order. Clinger first, and Cohen was with a O, so I got my name first. Bill Cohen was a senator from the state of Maine, and he really was the partner on the Senate side that got the bill through.
Right. Now tell me where you lived during your years in Congress.
I lived in Alexandria, Virginia. Well, of course, I lived in Warren, Pennsylvania, because I was representing that district. But I moved my family to Virginia. And I think that people don't do that much anymore. Now members don't tend to move their families there. And that has had a really, I think, harmful effect on the overall functioning of Congress, because as a result, members on the Republican side don't get to really know members on the Democratic side, and they don't form the kind of friendships that I think are really necessary when you're in a collegial body to get anything done. So one of the failings, I think, of the system the way it works now is that we just don't have that kind of collegiality in the body, and as a result, Republicans don't trust Democrats, Democrats don't trust Republicans, and as a result, we have gridlock and paralysis in the Congress.
Right. Now, I understood typically when one lived in Washington and raised your family there, your kids participated with other congressional children.
Absolutely, yeah. There'd be picnics, and you'd go to each other's homes for dinners and that sort of thing. And there were much more opportunities for sort of intermingling in a social setting. And if you get to know somebody pretty well, it's pretty hard to badmouth them and slander them, if you will, in public. So I think the tenor of the debate was much more civil, and now it's become much more abrasive and much more acerbic, and therefore not nearly as productive.
People are so willing to demonize other parties who may have a slight disagreement with them down the road. Now, during your time in Congress then, you had your kids here in Washington.
Right.
And that seemed to be a good situation for them. Probably made several trips during the year back to the district.
Oh, more than several. Every other weekend.
Every other weekend you return.
I would be back in the district. And in the early years, in my first probably 6 to 8 years, I was back every weekend. I mean, that was an important part of the. You risked being attacked for being, going big time, going to Washington and forgetting about the home people. So, and I didn't want to do that. I mean, I really didn't ever want to lose track and lose touch with my district. So I spent a lot of time back in the district.
Right. Now, another criticism of the current Congress is that congressmen have to spend so much time raising money. Did you see that become an issue?
It certainly has become a major issue. It's much more so now than when I first ran for Congress. I think my first congressional race, I had to raise and spend $100,000. That's just a drop in the bucket anymore. I mean, now congressional races cost millions, and it's just gotten completely out of hand. I was sort of fortunate in a way. In the first few years that I had opposition, I did have to raise money, but in my latter part of my career, I several times didn't have any opposition at all, and that meant I didn't have to really raise much money at all.
Right.
So it was not a problem for me. But I can remember that Arlen Specter, who was a senator from Pennsylvania for many, many years, and he told me at one time that when he ran for the Senate the second time, he had to spend every day for 6 years, basically, and raise an average of $10,000 a day to raise the amount of money he was going to need to advertise on television in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Harrisburg and all over Pennsylvania. And the cost just has become so prohibitive. I think that's one of the reasons that members there's been a great deal of turnover in the Congress in the recent years. And I think one of the reasons for that is that members just don't really like the job anymore. They have to spend too much time on the telephone begging for dollars, and they don't really get to do as much as they'd like to do in terms of legislating.
And the issues don't get spoken to.
They don't get spoken, and they don't get any easier.
Right. Right. Now, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit, on the way up we talked about the district you were in and this process of redistricting.
Right.
I wonder if you could tell me your current take on the process as we know it now and what you might think about changing.
I would be delighted to tell you.
In great detail.
It's a cross that I'm bearing these days, because I think one of the problems that we have is that the Congress is really not very representative of the American people these days. The reason for that is that, for a variety of reasons that I will mention, the Republicans and members of the Congress now tend to be way to the right of the mainstream of the Republican Party. And conversely, the Democratic members of Congress these days tend to be way to the left of the mainstream of the Democratic Party. So the middle of the electorate, which is the majority of the American people, really isn't being represented. They're not being heard because the voices are shouting on the right and the left are not listening to the moderation. Now, the reason for this is, frankly, we have become so adept. Well, first of all, we have to reapportion the country every 10 years. We take a census, and you have to divide the country into 535 equal districts. No member is supposed to represent any more people or less people than every other member of Congress. So we have to reapportionment. Now the magic number is somewhere around 590,000 people per district. And we can do that very, we've gotten very artful in the way they do it. And the redistricting is done by the General Assemblies of all the states. It's not done by the Congress. It's done by the several states themselves. So it's a political process. And the problem is that they've become so adept at reapportioning the district that you can make a district that is almost overwhelmingly Republican or almost overwhelmingly Democratic, and that means that you don't really have a contested election between Democrat and Republican. You may have and do have a contested election between a Republican and a Republican in the district, or a Democrat and a Democrat in a heavily Democratic district. And the result is that usually the more conservative Republican will win in that sort of situation, and the more liberal or progressive Democrat will win in that sort of a district. So over time, the Congress becomes increasingly polarized as the membership becomes more and more sort of rigidly conservative or rigidly liberal. The way we can correct that is to change the way we do the reapportionment, and my suggestion is that we should have what California now has, which is you have basically a bipartisan or nonpartisan commission of reputable people who are going to sit down and look at this thing and do it as an even-handed way, so that this districts overall are going to be competitive, Republican and Democratic, across the board. That will mean over time that the representatives are going to be much more moderate and much more willing to negotiate. I mean, when I was in Congress, we felt that we were prepared to legislate, but we were not going to do it perfectly. But we knew that we were trying to do what was possible and not perfect. And nowadays, unfortunately, perfect drives out the possible.
Right. Now, I remember reading stories that Democrats and Republicans some years ago would go at each other in public, and then when they were through with that, Jerry Ford as a majority leader and Tip O'Neill would sit down together, have stronger beverages than we have at Access Channel 5,
right.
and they would lay it right out, and each of them had enough discipline within his party to say, okay, this is the way it's going to be, fellas, ladies, and we're going to do what's best for the country.
But that's basically, that spirit is gone now. As you can see, the thing that really is worrying me these days is that Congress has never been really well thought of, frankly. I mean, the Congress has always been sort of a whipping boy. And, Mark Twain said, no man's life or property is safe so long as the Congress is in session. And, that was, there have been a lot of bad remarks about Congress. But today, that isn't limited to Congress. Congress is has the lowest approval rating in history. It's about 7% of the American people think they have any business being there at all.
Right.
The presidency is in really bad repute at this point. The president's approval rating is in the low 40s, and that's extraordinarily low. But even worse, and even more worrisome, today the Supreme Court, which has always been considered sort of the bellwether, the more reputable, the more sort of grown-up body of government, their approval rating is down as well. So what we find is that the American people, by virtue of the fact that Congress is right now paralyzed, they don't really trust any of the elements of government, and that's a very unhealthy thing. The we the people is no longer really applying because the people don't really feel that the government is representing them.
I have looked at the Supreme Court, and I'm just shocked at the lack of diversity. The court comes from a total of 2 out of 300 law schools. We heard this past week 5 the justices spent their childhood in New York State, as I did. They have all served in the appellate district in the Northeast. So we have nobody who's been out west, nobody who's run a business, nobody who has served in major executive positions within the government, such as we discussed this week at Chautauqua. Nobody who's been Attorney General or other major jobs where they would litigate and had major departments.
That's right.
And that's a major shortcoming.
I agree.
And we can go a step further and say, what? We have 5 Catholics and 4 Jews. The
country, no Protestants.
No Protestant, and the country is primarily a Protestant country.
Right. It still is, I know.
And so indeed that is a major shortcoming, and it's.
So that's I think it's a worry down the road is if this thing keeps getting exacerbated. It needs to be addressed now, not down the road. We really need to begin to say that, look, the Congress, the government is just not functioning very well. The one hope that you have is that the American people will sooner or later going to say, why are we paying these clowns? I mean, they're in Congress, for example. They're not doing anything. They don't pass legislation. They don't negotiate. They don't. They're ineffective.
Right.
So maybe the revolt will be, there'll be a sort of a revolution. A lot of members will be thrown out, hopefully it'll get new people in who would be more sensitive to what the American people really are interested in seeing happen. You know, right now we can't come to any kind of agreement on what to do about the influx of undocumented aliens into this country. How do we deal with the immigration crisis that we are developing here? We're not going to address it. The Congress is going to adjourn next week, and they'll be out for a month. They'll then be back for about 2 weeks or so in September, and then they're done for the year. So, you know, I think the American people are right to sort of say, we're not getting our money's worth from these people who are unable or unwilling to negotiate and compromise and to do the American people's will.
And say what is best for the country as a whole. Like with the immigration, there are two issues that have to be discussed, and people only seem to discuss one side of them. For example, the border should be closed and tightened. Right. And second, what do we do with this large number of undocumented
11 million of them.
And if somebody was brought here as a baby and now is graduating from high school or even some cases from college, right, and the only language that person speaks is English, is it appropriate to deport them?
Send them back to Honduras or Guatemala or someplace, but they don't even know the language.
They don't know the language. And what do we do with these children who were throwaways by their parents? If they're taken care of by a relative in this country, that is better, but large numbers of them are not.
Well, that's the problem, and it seems to me that there's a general agreement on both sides that we need to do something about it. The only problem is they can't seem to get their act together to make the kind of compromise that will have to be made on both sides, right, to make it happen.
Now, let's sort of do a timeline for just a moment. This is a little bit of a digression, but I think it's a useful one. Typically, how many years does it take, it's a practical matter, to get some idea through Congress? And I've heard typically 6 is in 3 Congresses. The first time Congressman Clinger puts a bill forward, people say this is terrible malarkey. The second time they say, well, it's really not so bad, we probably ought to do it. The third Congress comes along and he's put together a constituency, the thing passes.
Right, that's about right. I mean, the Clinger-Cohen Act took about six years.
6 years.
And the reason for that, I think, basically is that, you have people are going to resist whatever you come up with. There are going to be lobbying groups that are going to be against whatever you're talking about. And I found that in the Clinger-Cohen Act, there were people who had big contracts with the federal government. They didn't want to see the system change because it was going to hurt them. They were in a catbird seat, as they say. They used to be able to do it. Now that's, it's not. And the other thing that you have to deal with is you have to be able to get it. If you're going to get it done in one term, you got to get it done in 2 years. If you can't get it done in 2 years, you have to start all over again. You don't start from where you leave off in one Congress. You have to go back and reintroduce the bill, have hearings on the bill, and have it come out of subcommittee, and then get to full committee, then get to the Senate, and then get a compromise, and get a conference committee, and pass the bill. So it's understandable that most serious legislation is going to take more than one term to get itself passed.
Right. Now, I did a tour of my military career as Congressional Relations Officer in Army Special Operations Command.
Right.
And we watched things get into conference committee. Well, I've been out of government for 15 years. I'm feeling that the committee that would settle things, the conference committee, that process is severely broken.
Totally. I mean, you don't, in fact, quite often they don't even go to conference.
Really?
It just doesn't happen. I mean, the leadership does something and they try and avoid having a conference because they know that conferences are going to be stultified. They're going to be immobilized because there are going to be such hard feelings on both sides of the aisle that they can't agree on a conference.
And so they become a waste of time.
So basically, the leadership now in both the Senate and the House basically have much more control over what gets to the floor and what gets passed and what doesn't, because the conference committee have proven to be, in this present climate, an ineffective way of getting anything done.
Right. I remember we had always several bills cooking, and we would see the members from both Republican and Democrat say, we want this to happen. I'm going to talk to so-and-so who will be in conference from the opposite party, and we're going to grease the skids and make this happen. And we often would get some very desperate calls. We need some more information. Burn the night oil. We don't care if you don't go home till 1 o'clock in the morning. Right. But indeed, that stuff was provided, and the process worked quite well.
I think it
can.
can work well, and it will again. I'm sure that we'll get some sense back into the system at some stage of the game here.
Right. Let's talk about a happier topic. Let's talk about your Chautauqua experience. Now, Your parents, your grandparents came to Chautauqua.
My grandmother, my father, she was a widow, and she came to Chautauqua after her husband died. And she was here for the first assembly in 1874.
Wow.
So she goes back a long way. Well, I'm 85, so she was she was 92 or something when she died. But so yeah, I'm a third generation Chautauquan. So I'm envious of people who came to Chautauqua, discovered Chautauqua. I mean, that they really sought it out and discovered it because they were inclined to do that way. And I have to say, well, I sort of inherited Chautauqua because it was in my family, and I didn't really, and frankly, at the beginning, I really didn't like Chautauqua very much. I was sent there to stay with my grandmother, and it was not I would go to the boys' club, and I would be ostracized because most of the kids were there all summer, and I was only there for a week or something. So I felt as though I was sort of an odd man out, and never really got to like it until I came back and worked on the Chautauquan Daily when I was both in high school and in college. I spent 4 or 5 years being a reporter on the Chautauquan Daily, so that's when I really fell in love with the place and have been in love with it ever since.
How big was the staff of the Chautauquan Daily at that time?
5 members, 5 or 6.
5 or 6.
Virgil Freed was my editor, and we had he had an assistant editor. We had 2 people who wrote stories, and we had a critic, David Holden, who wrote music critics and so forth. We now have guest critics all the time, but I think the staff is now, I don't know, 40 or something. It's a pretty big operation. We didn't put out as big a paper as they do nowadays. We had a 4-page paper, but now it's a much bigger, more grandiose publication.
Now, you spent a lot of time on the lake. Tell me about about your sailing. What kind of boat you're in? And
I sail a Flying Scot, which is a sloop-rigged boat, and it's a lovely boat. It was designed by a Scotsman who actually delivered the boat to us 40 years ago. I'm still sailing the same boat, and I've raced it on Chautauqua Lake for a lot of years. Still try to get out once or twice a summer, 2 or 3 times a summer, and I do that. But yeah, sailing has been a part of my life up here.
Right. Now, you were asked to join the Board of Trustees while you were here at Chautauqua. You had purchased a home.
Right.
So the family was here for the summers. Tell me about your entry into the Board of Trustees.
Well, it was sort of odd because I was, well, I'll tell you, frankly, the way it happened was that I was invited to a breakfast, and I learned later that they did the breakfast to sort of vet you and see if you would be good quality timber for the board, and I'd forgotten about it, and so they called my house. And Judy answered the phone. I was still in bed, and I said, "You're supposed to be at breakfast over at the Athenaeum." And I said, "Oh no, I'm not going to go over there. That's just a fundraising thing, and I don't have to go to that." So forth. So, and she said, "You're going to go to that." So I did, and it turned out that then, as a result of that interview, they invited me to become a member of the board, and I did. And then my problem was that at that time I'd just left Congress. And I was a senior fellow up at the Kennedy School, Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and I had to be there. I couldn't be at the opening meeting of my term, and Bill Carslake, who was then the chairman of the board, had a very strict rule. You didn't miss a board meeting. I mean, you better well be there. And as a matter of fact, it was the only one I ever missed in the whole time I was on the board, but I did miss that one, and so I got off to a rocky start. But I sort of worked my way up the ladder and was chairman of the Asset Policy Committee, which was really the key committee on the board. And I enjoyed that a lot. And
then from Asset Policy, you were chosen as chairman of the Board of Trustees.
Yes, and I'm not sure how that happened. Well, yes, I was.
Okay.
And I'm not sure how that came about. I actually didn't. I didn't seek the job actually.
Right.
But Bill Carslake came and said, we'd really like you to consider it. My wife thought it was a terrible idea. She thought it was not something that I would do that would be very time consuming. I said, well, I just feel I wanted to be my grandmother's grandson and do something for Chautauqua.
Right.
She was right. At the time was pretty, I used to say when I was not on the board, toward the end of a season, I would get very nostalgic and feel sort of sad the season's coming to an end, and I hate that. when I was chairman of the board, I would think, thank God the season's about to be over.
No catastrophes.
No catastrophes. We didn't have anything go horribly wrong in that year.
Right. So let's talk about some big things that happened on the board. I understand you hired a new president for the institution.
We did. And that was Tom Becker, who has been the president for the last, I guess 12 years now. And he's done a superb job. We had a fellow named Scott McVeigh who was the president, and he was served for 3 years. It really wasn't a very good fit for Chautauqua at the time, and I think he knew it, and the board sort of knew it, and so we did feel that we needed it. And Tom Becker had been here for a long time and was an incredibly effective in development and getting the necessary money to run the place. And so he really deserved the job, I thought, and so he took over, and he's done a superb job ever since. He just is, we've had some rough years, and the downturn in the economy over the last 4 or 5 years, he's run the ship of state, I think, extraordinarily well during that very tough time.
Right. Well, the books have been balanced, and some comparable institutions have had terrible debts, and he's kept the attendance up.
And the foundation has grown, the endowment has grown.
And the quality of the programs is high. Now, there are two other issues that occurred on your watch. You're not going to get away without talking about them. Which one do you want to do first? The transfer fee.
Well, I think the transfer fee probably was the most significant, simply because we have to pave the roads. I mean, we are running a town.
Right.
We have to pave the roads and maintain the sewer system and keep the potholes filled and so forth. And we really didn't have the kind of money to do that with. The fees that we charged were not sufficient to do that. So I was instrumental in getting through the board a requirement that when you sell your property, that the seller has to pay a 1% fee on that, and the buyer has to pay a 1% fee. And that particular amount of money has now been used very effectively, I think, to really upgrade the infrastructure. My other job in the Congress was I was vice chairman of the Infrastructure and Public Works Committee, so I'm a very strong believer in good infrastructure.
Right.
And we needed that. Our roads were falling apart and were not in very good shape. They were very old.
Yeah.
So we did that. We got that through. It was not something that made a lot of people happy at the time. People who were then selling their houses were not happy with that.
No. And the second major change
was we decided that we couldn't keep the Athenaeum Hotel functional and making any money at all if we didn't allow the sale of wine and beer. And so we got that through, and I made a lot of enemies there because, as you may recall, WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Association, was really founded in Chautauqua, and so there's a long history of temperance. And it was a real blow to have to get rid of it. But without that, we could not have maintained the Athenaeum Hotel as we've been able to do, because of the fact that we now sell beer and wine in the hotel and in other venues in Chautauqua.
I think most people would look at this and say, yes, the roads are immensely better than they were now that we have the transfer fee.
Right.
And we know that some of that money needs to be used on studies to plan so the infrastructure projects are more sensible, but it's not diverted into broadly unrelated topics. And second, the alcohol is serving a glass of wine with dinner has not turned out to be a problem in any respect whatsoever.
We don't see drunks running around the grounds. I mean, it's not a problem. It really is not.
That's still it. Now, in our closing moments here, tell me about your children, your grandchildren. Who are Chautauquans?
All of them.
All
I
of
have
them.
4 children. My daughter Bijou is practically the mayor of Chautauqua. I mean, more people know her than know me or anybody else. And she's going to actually be performing, as we know, tonight. But
right.
And our son Will is an actor and performer out in Chicago, and so I have 4 children, two daughters and 2 sons, and then I have 7 grandchildren, and they all spend time in Chautauqua every summer. So that's one place where the whole family gets together.
Do you have a big holiday that you celebrate?
Yeah, 4th of July. Oh, I mean
at Chautauqua.
At Chautauqua is always a big, and we've spent Christmases here quite often. So it's the one place. When I was in Congress, we went back and forth between Warren and Washington a couple of times, and this was the one place where the family really felt they had long-standing roots, and that's the case it's still today. I mean, they really feel this is their home.
So it's like what Dan Bratton said, welcome home.
Welcome home, exactly.
That's it. This has been lots of fun. My guest today on Chautauqua People has been Congressman Bill Clinger. My name is John Viehe. Thank you for viewing.